Hi, and welcome to the History Hut. I'm Jim, this is Dr. K, and today we'll be talking about life in Carolingian times. So did the social structure of Western Europe change in the Carolingian era?
Yeah, I mean, it's much like the Merovingian period, except that the church has a lot more influence. Remember, we talked about the Christianization of Clovis and him having the mass baptisms of his soldiers, and then, of course, just saying that all his people are then Catholic or Christian. So in the Carolingian period, the bond between church and state, remember, is even stronger. So I think one of the things that you see in the Carolingian period and beyond is that the church has a significant impact on people's lives, on Frankish lives. And from the simplest of things, I mean, marriages are still arranged by the fathers. The husbands and new wives are handed over kind of to the highest bidder. You give the sum for the parents' authority, and women are expected, of course, to be faithful to their husbands. When are they not? They're always expected to be that. On the other hand, men were still okay to have mistress or a concubine, and of course the church is going to have a few things to say about that.
Oh, I don't.
Yeah. Otherwise, even today, you'd have concubines all over the place, and what would that do to the economy? I don't know. So the women that would be concubines or even just mistresses would probably be slaves, or it might be women from the estate that somebody held. So I mean, it can be an uneven social kind of exchange. But in order to limit this most un-Christian activity, the church tried to reinforce the idea that sex should be practiced only within the bounds of marriage, or within the bonds of marriage, whichever you prefer. So until this point, really, marriages were still just a civil bond between families, a civil arrangement between families, your father, my father, and just kind of get together and go, okay, this is the way it's going to be. But now, of course, priests made sure to add their kind of blessing to each union. And although it's not really until the middle of the 8th century, about 755, that the church councils insisted on the public celebration of this happy estate of marriage. It's still happy in the initial stages always. So why do you think the church decides that they want to make it public that you've just got married to somebody?
I don't know why.
To stop all your other girlfriends,
Oh.
right? Yeah. So it's the purpose is that once the union is common knowledge, the man would have more trouble convincing other women that he was still free as a bird, even in his village or in the next village. So this is one of the ways that the church intervenes in family life. And the church also helps. It doesn't end the practice of polygamy at first, but it tries to end or restrict the practice of polygamy by kings. Remember, we talked about Clovis and they being married to a Christian wife, right? So you kind of do that, and of course she wouldn't be too happy about any concubines. So the more you can kind of work it that way, the better. The church also acted as an overseer. Now, remember, we were talking about Charlemagne. He's got 5 wives and 5 mistresses, so it's not an entirely successful policy. But
but
you're supposed to. Yeah, you're supposed to set an example at the top to the rest of us. So the other thing was that a girl over the age of 15 or around the age of 15 now had to give her consent to her parents' choice, their marriage choice, or the marriage wouldn't be valid in the eyes of the church. So that's quite interesting as well. It's not, though, until much, much later, probably about the 12th century, that marriage is institutionalized as a sacrament in the church. But the church, all through this period, tries to emphasize the concept of monogamy and permanence, that once you're married, that's it. And we've seen this when we were talking about China, we were talking about India, all the different cultures, when you can get rid of your wife, when you can't. So, of course, the Catholic Church involved in this as well. So the first record that we have, although it's not a sacrament until later, the first record that we have is from the late 700s, when a church council declared that marriage could not be dissolved, that once you'd gone down that road, that was it. Not like today with the 60% divorce rates. So they condemned the practice of divorce and then moved to limit divorce to 2 instances. Now, we've seen in some other cultures like 7 or 8 instances. All you had to do was talk too much and you could get divorced. But in this case, it is flagrant adultery by the wife. Flagrant, not just adultery, but, you know, just slap in your face. You don't have to wait till the neighbors tell you. She just comes home and goes, your dinner's not on the table. Guess why? Because I was with Henry over there. That's why. So flagrant adultery by the wife or impotence by the husband. So you can imagine that given the choice as a husband between those two, I go saying to the priest, you know, I'm impotent, I'd like a divorce. Or my wife's having it off with somebody else, I'd like a divorce. You can guess which route you would go.
And it was flagrant
right?
too.
Flagrant as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely flagrant. She was crackling. And again, if you're the husband and you want to get a divorce, what are the chances that you're going to get a new wife or any kind of girlfriends at all if everybody in the village thinks you're impotent?
Yeah, that's true.
So it really comes down to more or less one reason for divorce.
Yeah.
You catch the wife, and this is in the era before Pinkertons and photographs, so I'm not sure if they just painted a picture of the wife with somebody else and then showed it to you or what happened. And then in the 9th century under Louis the Pious, the son of Charlemagne, the church won the right from the king to prohibit divorce altogether. But it takes a long time, in this period at least about another century before they can actually kind of stamp it out at all levels. The prohibition on divorce, though, we can argue helps women. And it helps women because until that point, and when it's still just a kind of civil arrangement and it's the Frankish people, you could just hand your wife back if she was barren or if she was just but ugly, or she was kind of hairy and that didn't really appeal to you anymore. Although, you know, you see lots of bearded women in the circus and stuff, you know. So you couldn't just after the church becomes part of this whole deal, you couldn't just hand a wife back. You couldn't just say to her dad, yeah, I can't be bothered with that. And so it really strengthens women's positions. And of course, it means you know, in this period, it's very difficult to live on your own. So the basic social and economic unit is the family, and so your children would be in a very vulnerable position as well if the wife was able to just kind of be handed back at a moment's notice. So you know, this kind of gained acceptance that it was okay, it was perfectly okay for the church to be influential in this sort of way, and so it's the married couple that becomes the norm. You have, you know, still multi-generational families, certainly in Western Europe, but now it kind of shifts to the husband and the wife and their children. So now you have more of a kind of nuclear family, and you know, you could argue that's down to church interference as well. So that's one of the ways that the church is influential and kind of changes the Carolingian society.
What was the attitude of the church to sexuality?
Oh, you had to ask that.
It's a question that has to be asked. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, the church had some very, very strict and rigorous views on sex and sexuality, and these were felt naturally throughout society as well. The highest and most perfect state of man was on earth was thought to be the celibate state, complete abstinence. We call it vir, V-I-R. Virtue comes from that. So in the early church, this isn't actually a required element of the program to be a priest. You didn't have to be vir, you didn't have to be celibate. It comes in with the Gregorian reforms much later on, and even then, one of the arguments is that celibacy is an economic issue as well, because you know, it's enough that the church has to support the priests, never mind supporting a wife and family members. So it's one of the arguments. But the other one is that, of course, vir, this state of celibacy, is when you're closest to God. So the rest of us, I guess, don't count that way at all. You know, we're kind of just the ordinary people. So Pope Gregory issued a prohibition on clerical marriages, but there's a lot of resistance to it at first and for a while. And Again, it looks as though quite a few priests and higher ups, a lot of the bishops in this period and after are actually going to become state appointments and not necessarily spiritual as they may once have been. So if they're not married outright, like they're not actually married, they have unofficial wives, and so after the reforms, this is all supposed to change. So this is, post-Carolingian, but still important. So they have unofficial children and they have unofficial wives, and that's really an issue. And one of the troublemakers of the day is a wonderful example, and probably totally unfair because there are not lots of it. It's just like one really outstanding example. The Bishop of Liège, Henry of Gelders, he fathered, or supposed to have fathered, 65 illegitimate children before being thrown out of office in 1274. So it's like, that's a busy man. Much busier than Charlemagne even. So lots and lots of kids. So one of the ways around the reforms was to marry young, and then when your wife died, become a priest. So, once the glitter was off the relationship and the old bag had kicked the bucket, then you would take up the cloth. So you'd actually been in the world and now you're kind of back out of it. And of course, of all the church fathers, that St. Paul that laid down the idea that celibacy was superior to marriage, and he equated spirituality and the body as a temple. And he did say, though, that for the rest of us, the weaklings, for the rest of us, the hot-blooded, this famous quote, it is better to marry than to burn with desire. Ooh. And I understand you're going to be getting married yourself soon, so... Is that why?
Yeah, that's
oh,
exactly
no, I don't want to
why.
get too personal. So you have other religious philosophies as well current in Europe and Eurasia, like the Gnostics and the Manichaeans. I've talked about Manichaeans before. And they felt that anything that was of the flesh was inherently evil, and also, more or less in a broad generalization, that anything from the belly button down was a creation of the devil. So just,
the knees?
Human, the toes, the shin. I mean,
the shin,
the shin maybe.
If you've ever been kicked in the shin, you know.
That's true. That is. So in the New Testament, sex was said to be an experiment of the serpent, a foul way of life, and of course, a selfish passion created by the fall. Back to the old Adam and Eve thing. So lust and sex become part of the doctrine of, kind of associated with original sin. And the sense is that God gave us the instinct to continue the species, but lust had turned it into something nasty and shameful. And that's, I think, we're all brought up to believe that too, or in the past anyway. So there's no need to enjoy it. It's something you have to do.
Right.
It's like lie back and think
like
of
work.
England. Think of how many Oilers have scored in the last 5 losses.
Punch the clock.
To keep your mind off it, because
break for lunch. Back to work.
Read a book. Just do something ordinary while you're engaged in the act. St. Augustine's view on marriage and sex was that because of Eve, there was, of course, a moral taint on all carnal unions. And I think even the use of the word, you think about it, you think sex, well, it doesn't sound all that loaded a word, but being carnal or fornicating, those are really, you're like, whoa, fornication, man, that sounds like you're really, really getting involved with something.
Sounds scientific.
Do you think so?
A little bit.
Oh, I don't think it sounds scientific. I think it just sounds like you're going to be involved in all sorts of lusty,
sounds like an official
nasty things. But sex, that could just be kind of like lie back and think of England. Don't really worry about it too much at all. Just go about your daily business. Don't mind me, I'm having sex. But fornication, I think you really have to be focused on that. You're like, let's do something carnal. Whoa! It just sounds so meaty. So St. Augustine said that all carnal unions were kind of bad. And there were only 3 reasons for sex in marriage. The first was for procreation, of course. And you'll notice it's procreation, not recreation. Yeah. The second is for social stability. And the third is cute. The third is the safeguard it gave against fornication. So sex is a guard against fornication, which makes you think that fornication is, in fact, you're a bit more involved in it, and not just... So Married couples, of course, should only have sex to have children, and they should avoid copulating for pleasure. There's the third word. That sounds like you're really going to be involved in something really
Sounds
serious.
like a contract must be signed.
I don't know what's with you in these. You're just not used to these words. I think you probably think sex all the time. So then, of course, you've got St. Paul. It's better to marry than to burn with desire. And St. Jerome, even more hardline, saying that sex in marriage was intrinsically evil as well. It's kind of like stay away from it. He rejected sexual pleasure as filthy and loathsome. So people wonder why everybody in the West got kind of guilt complexes about sex. Yeah, look to the early church. And some good examples from the period, of course, after what we're talking about, like kind of the 12th, 13th century. In 13th century France, if you were denounced as an adulteress and an adulterer, you were paraded naked through the streets. And then, of course, this has a long kind of history, because if you think to World War II, women who slept with Nazis, women who slept with German soldiers, they had their heads shaved and were paraded through the streets as collaborators. So this is a kind of long-term thing. In 14th century Germany, adulterers were buried alive or impaled. Not a nice way to go. And it doesn't even say if that was flagrant or not. So that's just like regular stuff. And in 13th century Sicily, a man's property was confiscated and the woman had her nose slit. So that everybody would know that you had fornicated or copulated or done one of those nasty, nasty things. So very, very interesting. So God gives us, as I said, the wherewithal to keep the species going, but we're not supposed to enjoy it. And St. Paul said, if you couldn't live without it, the next best thing was to have sex for the explicit purpose of procreation and to make it as passionless a job as possible. In other words, marriage. You just have to listen to those shows like Dr. Phil to see where it all went horribly, or Springer, or who's the other, like Maury. It's like, that man's sister's brother's cousin had my baby, and just like really all sorts of crazy things. So it has to be marriage. It has to take place within the institution of marriage, and it's not supposed to involve any kind of pleasure at all. And St. Paul also, of course, maintained that women had been created for the benefit of man and had to defer to him in all things. And there's a really good book called Eunuchs for the Kingdom of God by Una Ranka Heinemann, and she talks about the mistranslations from the originals and how what we think St. Paul says actually completely wrong. He didn't actually say that at all. But of course, good Christian women were expected to hide their charms and obliterate their sexuality, although it's of course women who are instrumental in keeping the early church alive, and wealthy women were patrons of the church and patrons of monasteries as well. But women are thought to have probably too much freedom. Lots of women choose as an alternative to just get married and having babies. A lot of women chose to enter convents where they could actually receive an education and wouldn't die young as a result of problems with childbirth. So by the time of Charlemagne, the church is acting to bring women under control, and they wouldn't allow religious women to teach boys or indeed to preach, because St. Paul had argued that shouldn't happen. And over time, women are actually excluded from the church hierarchy, and even their religious houses that they had run as abbesses were put under the control of local abbots. So their formal religious position is restricted as well. Women are not to teach at all. And I'll just finish off by mentioning that the major sexual sin of the early church was the practice of contraception. Of course, the punishment in ecclesiastical courts for having practiced contraception could be penances lasting huge amounts of time, like years at a time, and include fasting. Lots of other non-Christian religions condemned one or two sexual practices, positions and partners, but the Christian church prohibited almost everything that it heard about. If it didn't think that sex should be fun in the first place, it certainly wasn't going to, let you do it lots of ways. So there's a rigorous schedule of sexual activity, and homosexuality isn't really mentioned, but when it is, it's soundly condemned. You risked your head or your testicles, as castration was one of the penalties, and they had a long list of various acts, of a homosexual nature. So we have to assume that they occurred and the church found out about it. The other thing they didn't like, and who does, was bestiality. You know, we've got to leave those dogs and cats alone. So bestiality was a bit of a problem. And there's a list of animals that are normally used. So it's a real issue. And there's this wonderful book called Strange Histories. And in chapter 3, it's called They Hang Horses, Don't They? And it talks about the horse of a nobleman who was convicted of rape. And the man and the horse that were involved were both hung. So the animal suffered as much as the man. And there's an absolutely fabulous example of a man in, this is a wee bit later, a man in New England condemned for bestiality, and he had to do an ID parade and point out which animals he had ravaged and which he hadn't. And then he was hung, and then they were all burned alive. So this is from the actual trial. Whereas some of the sheep could not be so well known by his description of them, others with them were brought before him, and he declared which they were and which they were not, and accordingly he was cast by the jury and condemned and executed. A very sad spectacle it was. First the mare, then the cow, and then the rest of the lesser cattle were killed before his face, and then he himself was executed. The cattle were all cast into a large and great pit that was digged for that purpose, and no use was made of any part of them. And there's some other really spectacularly amusing kind of show trials of animals, you know, a sow that attacks a human, and then the sow's taken to court and actually brought into the court, and all the little piglets come in as well, and the jury decides that the sow is guilty, but the piglets can be let off, and they'll go to a farmer, but if they ever show any tendencies like their mum to attack a human, then, you know, they'll be brought back to court. So it's just hysterical, really, really funny. A couple of cases, a case for buggery with a mare in Edinburgh, both were put to death. Bestiality with a dog, both hung and burned in public. It just all sorts of really crazy things about that. So bestiality is really a big deal. We don't know how much attention people actually paid to the church. Obviously, people used homeopathic ways of, trying to avoid having babies, but the very last thing that the church has an impact on in terms of kind of sexuality and family is children, because it was common practice still for infanticide, and the church said, no, that's wrong, you shouldn't be killing your babies. If you have children and you can't look after them, bring them to the abbeys, bring them to the monasteries, and we'll bring them up, we'll look after them. So they have an impact in that as well. So infanticide drops off as well.
Very interesting stuff. That does it for us down here in the History Hut. We'll see you next time.